Anita, how's your mental health?
Questionable at all times. You know this.
Yeah, how's the mental health of your children?
Also a little bit tricky. Can I tell you my experience in trying to find therapists for myself and my kids, Mel?
Yes, please.
Okay, this is how it goes. You ask around your friends and your family for a referral for somebody who's nearby. You finally find somebody who sounds like they might work for your family. You give them a call and you find out that A, they're not accepting new patients, or B, they have a huge wait list. So you start over again and you ask people if they know anybody who would be a good therapist and a good fit. Finally, you find one, you go and you meet with them, and you figure out that you don't actually like them that much. But it's been so much work to find somebody who you can go to in your area that you're kind of stuck with them. Well, do you have any ideas for how to get around this?
I do because guess what? I've actually had some therapists that I have found on my own, which involves what you're saying. Sometimes I remember one time I was like 3 hours in the bathtub on my phone looking
Yeah.
through websites. I was such a prune at the end. But I have also had the experience with working with BetterHelp. And it was like, I don't want to say too good to be true, but because it is true, but it's like amazing because I was matched with my therapist within 24 hours.
And you didn't have to go through all of that other ridiculous process of trying to find somebody. And here's the cool thing too, is if that person didn't work out for you, you can just switch and say, and it's not like you're committing to another years long search for somebody who you're going to jive with.
It's true. And I lucked out, or maybe just BetterHelp is really good at matching people together because I never had to change my therapist. I loved her. Perfect fit for me. And I know that some of our friends have used BetterHelp and they've had to change therapists, and boom, same day, you can change.
Easy peasy.
You can ghost your therapist. Get a new one.
I love this idea. BetterHelp is one of our sponsors. If you use our promo code trybetterhelp.com/WWDN, you get 10% off your first month. And we totally recommend it.
Yes, get some therapy. That's trybetterhelp.com/WWDN.
It's a pretty exciting day. I'm excited to talk to our next guest, Mel. Are you ready?
Yeah, and I'm excited for you because this is definitely a parent topic.
Yeah, Mel's like, I will try to be helpful, but nah,
Yes.
I don't know about any of
I
this.
will help relay questions from grieving parents.
Yes. Okay, so we have a special guest all the way from where do you live? Special guest
Ottawa, Canada.
in Ottawa.
Woo!
Yes.
And your name
Yeah.
is Joanne
S-
Doucette, correct?
Yeah,
Did I say
Joanne
it right?
Doucette. You did. Perfect.
Okay.
I mean, you could
Okay.
add a little French accent if you ever want, because it is a
Doucette?
French Canadian name. Oui, Doucette. But I'm actually Anglophone, so don't get too excited and start speaking French to me.
It's not Joanne Doucette.
No, but sometimes I hear that. And I do speak French, but I'm not a Francophone, so then it's very disappointing when I respond.
Yeah, we aren't disappointed in you at all.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here and to have this chance to connect with your audience because I know how much parents look for support with their kids. So it's so nice to be able to hopefully help a few parents out there.
So, Joanne, tell us what you do and why we should believe you and why we're interested in talking to you.
So I'm a social worker slash therapist, and I've been in the field of working with kids and families for about 25 years now. And that's always been kind of my focus in social work is really loving working with kids and their parents, doing lots of parent support in lots of different settings. And I worked at the Children's Hospital in my city, working on inpatient mental health. That was kind of one of my first jobs earlier in my career, and really loved that. And then an opportunity came up to move over into palliative care at the hospital, so pediatric palliative care. And I took that and was a little worried at first because I didn't feel like I knew a lot about helping families that were dealing with terminal illness or grief. But I had always had an interest in that. And so working in that, I was in a hospice that's kind of attached to the hospital. And I ended up doing a lot of grief support with parents who had experienced the loss of a child. But of course, it was family support. We had kids that experienced the death of a sibling and really developed a strong interest in bereavement through that position. And eventually I moved out into the community doing private practice and saw that there was a real need. You know, there wasn't a lot of therapists specializing in this area, and there was a huge need and lots of people looking for support. And I started getting a lot of referrals as well for people who had experienced the death of a spouse, and especially people really wanting help for their kids who had experienced the loss of a parent and other losses too. So that's kind of how I came into it, and it's been a really rewarding part of my work, and I really love working with those families.
Can I just say something that irritates me and just get it off my chest? Every therapist
Mm.
in the entire world lists grief as one of their specialties, and I feel like they're all lying.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Or very few of them actually do a lot of that. I think that you probably receive a little bit of training in school, but then I don't know.
Well,
Is that true or
it's
false?
no, it's such a good point you make, Anita, because I was just talking about this with one of my psychologist colleagues the other day, and I was saying, did you get much training? You know, they've done PhDs, and they said there's not a lot built in around grief, but there should be. And that was, even though I mean, I graduated in 2000, so that's going back a long ways. And I don't know how much that's changed in these programs, but it's definitely a gap in our training. So actually, a lot of the referrals I get are from my therapist colleagues who might already be working with a family, and then there's a loss, and there's often a feeling of I'm not equipped. I don't know what to do to help. So I would agree that it's a gap, 100%. And really every therapist should get the training and the resources to feel more confident, because loss comes up all the time in our
Yeah.
work. And you don't always know. You could take in a referral because someone's really anxious, and then when you end up meeting with them, you could find out that connected to that is that they've had some significant losses. So yeah, I would back you up on that. It's something we need to work on in our field.
Yeah, it's really interesting because some of the things that we hear have been said to some of our fellow widow friends are harmful. Like even things like, well, it's been a year, so you need to just stop thinking about your person, or it's time to move on. Like even just language, which is really shocking. I don't know about the psychology field so much. I did a little bit in social work, and so I know that there's a lot of sensitivity training like with words. Yeah, you know, and so I found a lot of the social worker therapists have been maybe a little bit more helpful in general, and I don't know if that's why, but yeah, even some of our friends who are psychologists, they'll message us for resources on grief, and we're like, that's really fascinating.
Maybe the social work background might help because we do a lot around, person in the environment and looking at bigger societal issues that impact people, and not so much the medical model. And I think that's really important with grief.
Mm.
So when you mentioned about, why are you equipped to do this? I don't consider myself a grief expert. I think that's kind of a dangerous label for anyone to take on. But I did seek out a lot of training. I went to the States and did training with Alan Wolfelt, whose work you might know at Center for Loss. And I loved his approach and other approaches I've really learned from, because they were more holistic, where
Mm.
there's no timeline for grief, right? Where we're being cautious around pathologizing it, putting a label on there being something wrong with the person if they're still intensely grieving after a year. And that's always felt more comfortable for me.
Mm. That makes sense.
Interesting. So
Hmm.
just as kind of some, background, I guess, you guys, if you've listened to the podcast, you know that I have 4 kids. My kids were 12, 8, 5, and 2 when Jason died. And those numbers are seared into my memory. I cannot tell you how old they are now, but I know they were 12, 8, 5, and 2 when Jason died. It's been 5 years. So really they're 17, 14, 10, and 7 now. And dealing with them grieving while I was also grieving was it's not over either. Like I say, it was the biggest challenge, but it still pops up and it's still very challenging. But I know that there are a lot of our listeners who are also in that same type of situation where you've got kids, whether they be little kids, infants, toddlers, school-aged children, preteens, teens, and then even into young adulthood, where I feel like a lot of the support kind of drops off and we expect them to just be okay and to figure it out, and they have no one to turn to. So that's just kind of the backdrop. And Mel, she's like, I have no kids, but she's an ally of the parents.
I am. And I
Yes.
have been a kid. I guess I'm the child of a grieving parent. My
That's
dad
true.
died, but I'm 42, so that's a little strange. But I'm here to help facilitate questions from our friends who had some questions about parenting and loss.
Yeah.
Yeah. And no wonder it's a topic that maybe so many of your listeners are asking for more about because, a parent's well-being is so tied to their children's well-being,
And vice
right?
versa.
And vice versa. Exactly. And one of the reasons that I really try and prioritize, making space whenever I get a parent reaching out, who's experiencing the loss of a spouse and trying to get support for them and their kids, I just have seen in working with so many people in that position that I just, it's hard to even put into words the layers of stress and vulnerability. Like, as you just mentioned, having four kids, your own intense pain that you're going through, and then trying to suddenly adapt to single parenting, not having the other parent there to help you through the worst time in your life, and
Yeah.
your kids going through the worst time in their life all at once. So there's this huge adjustment that first just has to happen, like trying to even adjust to like how do we go through each day? And then, like you said, it actually goes on, right? At each stage of development, kids may be experiencing their grief differently, and the parent is also experiencing their grief. So there's a really strong need for support in general, like the informal supports in community and within families and among friends. But sometimes there is a need for that professional support too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the questions that's kind of just a baseline question is how are we supposed to do this? How are we supposed to support our kids while we are going through that intense grief ourselves? I mean, I remember just feeling like I was drowning and I was supposed to be keeping myself alive and saving, literally the lives of four other humans when I didn't even think I could keep myself going. And just
Mhm.
how are we supposed to do that? And can you give us a pill or like a little pamphlet that will
A
make it all
prescription,
better?
a guidebook. I wish I could. Yeah. Well, so what I would say to start is something I talk a lot when I have parents reach out to me and say, okay, I've just experienced the death of my spouse, and I really want to get my kids in to see you. Over the years, I've adjusted my approach a bit to really strongly encourage that I first work with the parent because I think there's a strong motivation. Parents are often very altruistic. They're like, I can manage as long as my kids are okay. And yet, again, like we said, it's so interconnected. So I really try and first meet with the parent and really help them to process their feelings, to normalize aspects of what they're going through, to do a lot of really emotionally supporting them and then exploring, okay, well, what are you seeing with your kids? And giving like a little bit of psycho ed about what to look for and what's most helpful for kids in these situations to build confidence. Because that's the other part. I don't know if you can relate to this, but grief just knocks down your confidence, right? It's so common for people when they're grieving to say to me, like, I cannot even figure out what to make for dinner.
Still
Never
can't.
mind, how to run my house and care for the kids. Yeah, exactly. And so just trying to create, some stability, also build their confidence about what they are doing really well in terms of supporting kids, and then slowly and gently making suggestions about what else they could do to meet the kids' emotional needs, to provide safety and security when everyone's world has been turned upside down. So I really love working with the parent first. And I do find parents are generally really open to that when I explain why. When I explain, hey, I only get your kid like 1 hour every week or every second week. And I think I probably could do some good, but I think I could help you a lot more quickly if I support you because you're the most important person to your child, right? So when it comes from you, the really emotionally supportive response or knowing what to say or do, it has way more value than coming from me generally.
You just said some words though that I was like, well, I want to know more about that. And that was the psycho ed. Is that what it was? Because that sounds like
Yeah, sorry, that's probably like a therapist mumbo
well,
jumbo kind of
then
term.
I was like, did I hear that right? Because that sounds like a murder show and then education. I'm not sure. But what parents should be looking for, like, what are some of the things that we need to have our eyes and ears out that are things that need to be dealt with immediately? Or, when Jason first died, I felt this great rush to get everything fixed and solved and check some boxes right now. And, now I'm 5 years out and I'm like, well, that was silly. It wasn't going to happen quickly like that. But can you help
Yeah.
us to have some idea of what we need to be on the lookout for?
I'd love to explore that. And yeah, it's sort of a funny term, but basically what it means is just information based on what we know thanks to, I mean, we do have a lot more knowledge now. There's been research done and we know more about what people need when they're grieving. And also, honestly, the families. Like I've now had the privilege of working with hundreds of families that are experiencing grief, and they've taught me a lot that I've been able to then help other people with that information. Okay, so I'll give you one example. So in the immediate, days, weeks, and months after a parent has died, one thing, I just had a meeting like this with a parent for the first time this week, where the parent's saying, okay, I think my kids are doing okay, young kids, like elementary school age, but they seem to be doing almost too okay. So is there something I'm missing? And so we had this really great talk about how it's so important to know. I mean, even adults often reflect that for many months, even a year or so, it doesn't feel real all the time, that there's some shock and numbness that can be at play for a long, long time. Even if the person's been sick and you have some advance notice, it still is very shocking when the death occurs. And so, actually being able to give a parent that information and say, there may be some shock at play, and also that's okay. One way that I think of it and I talk about with kids and with parents is it's almost like this bubble wrap around your heart and your brain, and the bubble wrap kind of like wears off slowly as the months go on. And that allows you to survive the thing that is almost impossible to survive if it hit you all at once. So I encourage parents, you don't have to rush it. They're not necessarily in denial. It's just really normal for kids to have some disbelief for quite a long time about what's happened. And parents will often then say to me, yeah, that makes sense because it still doesn't feel real to me. It almost feels like, is this just a really prolonged business trip they're on?
Yeah.
Or, yeah. And that's so to normalize that, that's actually quite normal. And when I've run support groups for kids and for teens that have all experienced the death of a parent, and it's so interesting listening to some of the conversations among the kids, and sometimes kids that are a year, 2 or 3 years past the loss. And one time, this group of girls were all sitting around talking, and they talked about shock, and they all said, oh, yeah, it took me at least a year before it seemed real. They told stories like, I was convinced it was a big prank and that, on my birthday or on Christmas, my dad was going to like jump out of a box and surprise me. It's kind of like heartbreaking, but also
Yeah.
it helps us to understand how initially they might not show all the emotions that we would expect them to. So I think it's reassuring. I hope it's reassuring for some of your listeners too, to know that, hey, if you're noticing that with your kids, okay, first of all, that there's a normal element to that. And then what can we do to slowly help them start to understand and accept and process the reality, right? So having kids involved, when there, if there's ever any kind of rituals or traditions that are associated with mourning, so if you do have a service or a funeral, involve kids, right? Because all those traditions and rituals exist for a reason. They are part of what helps us to process what's happening and to move towards acceptance. So if kids are open to it and up for it, give them a role to play, in those moments. If I know some of the families I work with now, there's a lot of flexibility around how we do that. And sometimes they wait until months after to maybe have a celebration of life. So if you're in that situation, involve your kids, give them a role to play, like whether it's reading a poem or, doing something that feels good for them to honor their parent. That's a way to help them start to move towards it feeling more real, but with lots of support.
So I have a question about, we talked about how sometimes we look at our kids and we think, well, they're not grieving enough, basically. And so sometimes
Mhm.
we will almost push them. We'll say things like, it's okay to cry and you need to cry and it's okay to cry. And they're like, what is wrong with you? Like, I don't need any of
Mhm.
that. But we've overlaid our own feeling about what's the right way to grieve with an adult mind onto their kids' minds. Can we push
Yes.
them too far? Sometimes we assume that unless we had a huge life insurance payout, we don't really need to know anything about investments or even finances. But guess what? A little knowledge of finances is critical for all of us. Maybe your partner was in charge of that stuff, and now you find yourself making all the decisions. Maybe you're mad about that. Maybe I am. Nicole from the He's Gone But the Money's Not podcast is here to help. She tackles financial literacy by telling the stories of women and widows and finance experts, and shares the lessons they've learned as certified financial planners. Whether you know a lot and feel confident in your financial decisions or feel unsure about all of that stuff, there is more to learn. Listen and subscribe to the He's Gone But the Money's Not podcast on all podcast platforms. This ad was paid for by Rockhouse Financial, an SEC registered investment advisor.
Well, great question. So, what I would say to that is, first of all, kids, when it comes to grief, they are different than us adults. And the best way I can think to describe it is they're more in the moment. And so their emotions can really fluctuate quite rapidly. And so if you see them, playing, maybe you're having a really emotional day. Maybe it's a day that holds some significance, or it's just a hard grief day, and they're aware of it. And you think, why are they playing with friends and looking like they are so happy? But kids can be really in the moment and feel really good. And then, a few hours later, they could be getting ready for bed and it could hit them and they could feel intensely sad. But we actually kind of want to let them chunk their grief like that. It would actually be really helpful for adults to be able to be more like kids in that way. It's actually a real strength when you think of how that helps them cope, right? That they still will turn to whether it's play or creativity and like that. I don't know if that makes sense, but that being in the moment and being genuinely okay in the moment, then maybe having an intense emotional reaction because they get sort of a grief burst, a big wave of grief.
Why is it always bedtime? Why is it always bedtime?
This is such a common, we should talk about that and the routines. I'd love to talk about that. So that's a great question. So should we be forcing it? I would say opening the opportunity, like opening the door and modeling for them that it's always okay to talk about it, to express all their feelings are okay when they have them. But if you're bringing it up and they're not responding and they're kind of looking at you like, what are you talking about? And I'm having a really nice time right now, then I don't think we need to force that at all. And it's nice, to leave it as is.
I have a question, and this is from the perspective of someone that helps with kids. I teach piano and I work with a lot of maybe 9, 10 through high school age kids. Although this is not directly a parenting thing, it's kind of a parent adjacent, somebody that's a responsible adult in somebody's life or a safe adult. And I want to get your opinion on if I could have helped in a better way with this situation. So on the car ride to the lesson, there was not a death that occurred, but the mom had dropped a big bomb on the kids. And she told me that when she arrived. She's like, well, I just told them something that's going to shake their world. And it was something that is similar to a death, but not, it just, everything is going to change, causing them to wonder if their world would be safe or, or changing. And she's like, well, you talk to a lot of people that have things going on, like, that are really hard. So I thought they could be a safe person for you, which of course I'm happy to be a safe person for any kid. But the part that was a little bit difficult was obviously I'm not a therapist and it was not in that setting. And I'm like, we're here for piano. But I think the mom wanted to kind of force them to have a conversation. And so in her mind, she was like, well, I just told them this and now let's talk about it, and trying to get them to see things from other people's perspectives. And I was caught because I didn't want to call out anybody in the situation. And all I could think was, well, I had Girl Scout cookies, first of all, that were delivered that day. So I was like, here. And one of the kids was a teenager and one was preteen. I was like, here, eat these. And totally different responses from the two kids on having to have a conversation that was about not piano. And all I could think to do was kind of inject some non-serious stuff in there, but also say, hey, here's my experience. Like when I go through hard things, sometimes you want to talk about it, sometimes you don't. And if you never want to ever, it's okay. You can always have a safe place here. And then I made a joke, but it was difficult because I felt like I was in a spot where it was like, let's have a serious discussion. And I'm like, but these kids, their well-being is at hand, and really it would have helped me the most to just have a discussion with the mom. And as they left, I did say, hey, all they need to know right now is that they're loved and their world is not changing, and that's it. Like, I wouldn't force them to do anything. And it kind of shook me for a couple weeks, and because I wasn't expecting
You
that. But
wanted to be there for them. So first of all, Mel, I think what you maybe were kind of considering in that moment is, well, just because us adults think that the way to work through the big feelings that come up is to talk about them, does that mean that these kids need to talk about it? So
yeah.
again, kids are different than adults. First of all, it's hard for adults that have just received a huge piece of information that has shaken our worlds to sometimes formulate words to describe what we're feeling. It's that much harder for kids who are still developing, who are still developing not just language skills, but there's a skill involved in being able to express feelings in words. So I think we have to be really careful, not to assume that kids, like have that ability or that that's the way that they are going to process their feelings. So kids process feelings in so many different ways. Adults do as well. It's not just through talking. Obviously, the three of us all really like talking about these things. This is why we're here. But kids also express feelings through play, through connection with nature, through sports, through music. Music's a big one for a lot of the kids, especially the teens I work with. I just yesterday had a family session where an 18-year-old boy asked if with his mom and sister, they experienced the death of the father, if he could play a song that was really, and we all sat there and listened to a song that was really important for their family, and everyone had tears. And that for that boy was like, I could see the processing of emotion just was so much. It was so helpful for him, right? Through music. So we just want to be open to all these ways of expressing feelings, and you nurturing with the Girl Scout cookies. That, you know why I love that? I just finished running a group. I ran a grief group all of last year, and my daughters, we call them Girl Guides here, but Girl Scout. And I always had to bring Girl Guide cookies. It became a thing with the kids in my group. And I think it was also a feeling of you're remembering what we love. It's making us feel really like you care. And, maybe this is something you were doing. So those are definitely such good, valid ways of supporting.
Good, because I was like, I don't want to traumatize anybody, and I don't know what to do. Eat these, and one of the kids ate all of them. I'm like, he's definitely stressed. And then, so okay, so you think I did an okay job with the Girl Scout cookies, and then I was like, here's my skateboard, go onto the ramp because they would trade lessons, and then we did music, right? So maybe that was okay.
All of those things were perfect, Mel. Girl Scout cookies are never the wrong answer. Like, never.
I know that wasn't a death related question, but I I don't want to harm anybody by being like, let's go now talk about everything. Because not even like you said, adults don't even process the same way.
So we asked some of our listeners if they had any questions that they would want to ask a child grief specialist. And I was really surprised at how many of them were kind of on the same topic. And the topic was, what do you do when your child doesn't want to participate in any of the things that you think they need to do? And I can understand this to a certain extent. There's a lot of like, well, just, they let them decide what they want to do and let them participate. But you're watching them as a parent and you're like, actually, I can see they're not okay. But they also don't want to do any of the things that I know might help them. Like, how do we help them through that if they don't want to participate?
Yes, that's a common dilemma. I've heard that from so many. When I was offering groups, that would come up. So many parents were enthusiastic and it was getting the kids on board. So, okay, something that I'm sure all the parents know. Often, if we can just get them in the door, right? Or get a first kind of connection, that will help reduce some of the unknown and the maybe nervousness that kids are understandably feeling. So something I would offer when I was running my groups is if there was, a parent reaching out and saying, I'd like my kid to come, I'd offer to like have a phone conversation or a quick like 15-minute Zoom call to tell the child a bit about group and give them, some more information. So look for a way to maybe create a connection and or show if it's a camp, like is there an open house where you can go visit the camp in the spring before the camp occurs? Maybe not, try and really work with the kid around also figuring out what's the hesitation. A big one that understandably a lot of kids have is this is going to be gloomy and sad, and I don't want to just talk about grief all day. Well, we know that actually most of the camps out there, and I know the grief groups that I was involved in and that I know of, we know you have to make it fun for kids. So we touch on grief through the activities, but there's also it's about connecting kids so they don't feel alone. That's a big reason we bring kids together because many of the kids that attended group would say the best thing is just being with other people who get it. So some advice I would give is try and create a connection, try and find out what's the hesitation, and get information that might open a kid's eyes to the other possibility that exists, that it could be different from maybe the image they have in their mind. I also remember one of the groups, the parents talking after group once we had gotten started, and one of the moms said, "I just use the mom card." She had that kind of relationship with her kids where if she really got firm and said, "You need to try this, and my expectation is you'll go." Again, that depends on the kids. Some kids are not as cooperative. I want to respect that every family has their own way. But if you do have that kind of relationship, think about saying to your kid, I want you to go to one or two sessions and try it out. And maybe also give that flexibility. If after a couple of times it's really not something that's helpful for you, then we can reconsider it. I think it's good to give kids some like choice and agency. So I don't know if that helps, but I do know it's a common scenario,
What
you
about
know.
what about when kids are just adamant that they're okay and they don't need any intervention? So they're just like, I'm fine. I also wonder about this because, in relationship to I have boys who are going through puberty, and it's pretty normal for teenage boys to also just any question you ask, fine, I'm fine. It was fine. The day was fine.
Yes.
So I'm always like, well, how much of that is just being that age and how much of it is just pretending like everything is fine? Or are they really fine? I don't know.
Yeah. Yes. So I have a teenage son, and yes, every text message I send, I get, okay, good, fine. He's been away at university. So that is, I think, developmentally quite normal. But of course, as a parent, there's that question for you. Well, is there more that they need or they could benefit from, and yet they don't even want to give it a try? So this is where, again, if you have a teenager, for example, who's saying, I'm really good, and I really don't need counseling, there's a few things I would throw out there. It could be true that they genuinely are coping with the supports they already have in place. If you're not seeing any other really big flags or warning signs that they're really struggling, like if they're engaged in like activities and going to school and spending time with friends and sleeping okay, those are all good signs that they may not need therapy. I think a lot of kids need it later on. They may get a little older and then start coming to you with more questions that they want answered or feelings that they need to explore. I've seen this a lot where I'll have a teenager, who comes in for therapy and now they're ready, even though it's like years since they experienced the loss. And so sometimes it's about timing as well. And I think that's okay. But it maybe circles back to if you're parents getting the support, right? So if your teenager or your kid really is resistant to therapy, I'd be careful about pushing it because I've had those kids come in and it's not always a positive thing for them, even though sometimes they get in the door and then they get engaged and they enjoy it. So parents getting support and getting the strategies is a good way to go.
This question actually seems like it goes kind of along with that. It's how to check in with your kids as their grief changes over time. So for this person's sons were 5 and 12 when their dad died. What about when they're young adults, moving through life? What's your advice there?
One way to do that is always, keeping that conversation going, like making it, a goal that, of course, we're not looking to get over our grief. We're looking to keep an ongoing connection to the person who died, to remember them, to honor them, and having having lots of opportunities where you talk about the person who died and you do things to remember them because first of all that's really healthy with grief, right, that we find ways to kind of keep that connection going, and then it also really gives opportunities for kids to hopefully see like, okay, my parent is really comfortable. They're talking about my parent, who passed away. We're doing something to remember them. It's like it's their birthday and we're making their favorite cake, or we're going to this restaurant they loved and, my parent is sharing a funny story or, right? Like those, it doesn't always have to be a, how are you feeling? It could be creating opportunities by talking about the person, by actively mourning, doing those things like the traditions, the rituals that make the ongoing grief process like a natural and healthy part of family life.
So I can't remember who talked about this, but somebody, I think they might be in the Widow Wives Club, their parent died when they were young. And they talked about how their mom, or it could have been their dad, can't remember, would like take them to the cemetery every week. And they didn't want to go to the cemetery every week. And it was so interesting to hear from their adult perspective that the mom's or the dad, the parents' attempt to really keep that ongoing was actually not helpful to them. They were like, it was sad, it was dumb. I didn't feel like it was helpful to me. I just felt like it was kind of making us all suffer when we were kind of like, didn't need that. So, how do we not do that?
Yeah, and I wonder if those kids had been given the opportunity to give their opinion on it, right? Like I wonder if they might not have felt comfortable to say to their mom, actually, we really don't like this because maybe they worried about making her feel bad or do you know what I mean? So
Hmm.
this is where I think opening up conversations and being really collaborative with kids is so important. So I've had family sessions where I've got the parent and kids together and an important date is coming up like Christmas holidays are approaching or the 1 year anniversary, and we have an open conversation about like what are the kids' ideas? Like what would feel special to you? What would feel meaningful? And kids come up with amazing ideas. And also it doesn't have to be always those maybe like traditional ways of remembering, like going to a cemetery. And I've seen families come up with really beautiful, meaningful, and sometimes, also enjoyable ways of celebrating the life of the person who died. And when the kids have a hand in it, obviously they're more invested. So I think this is where asking the kids opinions and maybe trying different ways as well. So I always say to families like, okay, you're trying to figure out what to do for the 1 year anniversary to remember and to mark this is an important date. But what you do this year doesn't have to be what you do every year. Don't feel that pressure. It's going to keep changing and evolving as the kids get older. And actually, it's a healthy thing if kids, as time goes on, maybe don't feel a need to do as much because it could also be a reflection of they've really incorporated this loss into their life story. It's always going to be a part of them. But of course, there's all these other parts of their life that are important too. And that's what we're going for, right? We want kids to have an identity that maybe part of their identity is my parent died, and that was a huge thing in our family, which is 100% true. And then also, I don't know, like I love sports, or I'm a really great friend, or I have an awesome sense of humor. And that's one of the things I do in my work with kids is really building up all those other parts of them, right? We don't want, and so I think sometimes I've seen that where kids feel like I'm ready to let go of some of these things that we're doing as a family connected to grief. And it might be hard for them to speak up to a parent. So,
I
yeah.
think that's so important what you just said, and it kind of just hit me so importantly, and just like, wow, yes, that's a part of their identity, but we don't want it to become their identity. And sometimes we as
Yeah.
parents try and overlay that because we don't think that they're doing enough to deal with the grief. And so we kind
Mhm.
of try and put that on them when they're like, actually, I have all these things about me and I'm learning and I'm growing and I'm adding all these skills as I develop. And this is just one big, it was a big deal, but it's only one of many things about me. So that's
Yeah.
important. Thank you.
And we don't want kids to feel bad about doing well, right? We want them to be able to feel like that's a good thing if, they're still always remembering that person, and yes, it's a part of their life, but they're building up these other parts of their life. And I do sometimes have both kids and adults that will feel guilty about feeling better. That's a really normal part of grief, I think. And so then we have a conversation, and I think it's good for parents to maybe keep in mind, you can say to your kids, hey, the fact that you're actually feeling better right now, that's like your capacity, to grieve well, to build your resilience. That's a good thing.
We have a lot of friends who have lost their partner to suicide, and a lot of those also have had children. So when those parents are trying to continue the memory of their partner, but there's some more complexities in that, what is your recommendation for that? How do they manage that? Because that's an added layer of a whole lot of stuff.
Hmm.
Like not making
Yeah.
they don't the and this parent that wrote in said, how do we remember them honestly, but not be too negative or too positive?
Hmm. And I do have a lot of families I work with where there were addictions or mental health issues. And I would say this is a good example of like, I don't think everybody that's grieving needs therapy, but I think it's no wonder that I often hear from families where there has been suicide loss or where there's been complex issues around addictions, because those are really complicated grief journeys to be on, right? Where there's a lot to work through. So I wonder if what those parents are saying is there's the part, there's all the good, right, that was in that person, and yet maybe because of, for example, the addictions, they may have engaged in behaviors that were really hard for our family, or there may have been things about the addictions that caused a lot of pain. And do we acknowledge that to the kids? Do you think that's the question they're kind of asking?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard because we often put dead people on a pedestal, but then on the opposite side of that, like you want to have honest conversations about what happened,
Hmm.
honestly, but not be too negative about. Yeah, so I think it's about kind of
Yeah.
honoring their memory, but also being honest about the circumstances and not trying to sugarcoat it or cover it up.
Yeah, and especially if there's like, I mean, a lot of times there's abuse in there, emotional abuse or all any of the kinds of abuse. And so I think it's kind of, the parent, I'm sure, I don't know with this situation, but in general, some of
Yeah.
our friends.
So honesty, super important, right? Kids are really smart and they will catch on quick to big pieces of information being hidden from them. And I've worked with a lot of kids who years after a parent's death find out, for example, it wasn't because of an accident, it was because of either, a drug overdose or suicide. And that is so painful. So I just want to let parent, if anybody's in a situation where out of love and protection, because usually those things aren't shared because parents are understandably trying to protect their kids, but know that that's a good place to get some support from a professional, or and lean towards the truth in a way that's really supportive. So being honest and then being ready to help the kids with the emotions that come up. And it's never too late to do that. So I just want to reassure everybody it's important to be honest and to be tell the kids the truth about how their parent died and if there were addictions at play. Sometimes they're really little and they don't understand that. So you may have to, as they get older and they're able to understand more, and you can share it a little bit at a time. And at the same time, you can keep sharing all the good. We want kids to know, we want them to be able to think of that parent and know the good things about them because they come from that parent, right? So it does affect how kids feel. So maybe that person was like really musical and really talented, or maybe before they developed addictions, they did something really important in their career, or they had great relationships. Like, share those things with the kids. And sometimes I have parents that, understandably, because of their own complex grief, are having a hard time acknowledging the positives. So I help them with that. I'm like, even if you have to kind of put it on a little and fake it till you make it, find the opportunities to share a positive memory and build up that kid's um, sense of there was like this good in my parent and it's okay to remember, and at the same time be honest and like do some support around how, for example, addictions or mental health issues can change a person's personality. So you can approach it with compassion, like this was a really hard thing that your parent went through, and it was a hard thing our family went through, so like in a compassionate way towards that person. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, I think so. You mentioned something. You said that kids are really smart. And sometimes I think they're smart, and sometimes I'm like, where is your frontal lobe? But one question that we have is how how do we deal with kids who are pushing boundaries, and some kids who have kind of figured out that grief is the get out of jail free card. How do we know how hard to push and how much to discipline and how much, leeway we should give them and how much we should back off and how much we should dig in when it comes to, just even normal childhood behaviors, but then maybe even when they're pushing
Mhm.
those a little bit more.
Yeah, like going to bed on time, for example,
Oh, I
or
hate
yeah,
bedtime. It's
as
the
you
worst.
mentioned, yes, so many hours in my office spent with parents talking about bedtime for good reason because, parents are at the end of their limits of patience and tolerance, and then, all of a sudden kids are like wanting to talk about all their feelings. And okay, so good question. So one way I would just describe it to parents is if you think about how we want kids to feel safe and secure, the death of a parent definitely upends everybody's life, and there's often a lot of increased anxiety, right? Like what else could happen? It's, really overwhelming. So we want to help kids feel safe and secure. And one way that kids actually do feel safe and secure is when their parent is holding the line, having expectations and limits that, yes, might have some flexibility, right? Like you're having a really hard day, once in a while staying home from school for a mental health day when kids are grieving. I fully support that. But knowing that when you stick to kind of routines and expectations and they still see you as the parent that's, in charge and able to manage all that, it actually helps them feel secure. It actually really helps them with their emotions, even though they're going to test all the limits and push back. So I would encourage parents for sure, so things like getting kids back to normal activities and routines after someone's died, like getting back into school and, going to your sports practice, those are really positive things for kids. So even if they're pushing back and saying, I don't feel like it, I can't, gradually moving towards that with support. So that would look like validate the feeling. Yeah, you're having a rough day and you really don't feel like going. Like you might feel really tired. And it's true, grief makes us feel really tired. I believe you, buddy. Like that's really hard. And then number two, move them towards, whatever the goal is with confidence they can cope with it. So I believe you're tired. I would love for us to go eat some breakfast. How about you get dressed and then let's reassess how you're feeling. I think you can do this and I'm here to support you.
What about for older teenagers who are kind of starting to be a little bit more autonomous? I have a 17-year-old and I find myself saying like, are you going to go to school today? Like, are we going to school today or are we not going to school today? Because I'm losing,
Mhm.
a little bit of that authority and she's starting to make more of her decisions for herself. And I think that's also normal in regular parenthood. But then when grief is
Mhm.
interposed on that, any suggestions for that age group?
Yeah, I
Just
think
give
with
up?
teens, no, it's tempting sometimes. Um, with teens, I think it becomes more and more, a team effort, right? There has to be. So again, I think actually listening a lot to teens and seeking to understand what the issue is, for example, about whether they want to go to school or not, versus like right away imposing our will is super important. So if, for parents to kind of catch what the instinct might be. So if your teen says, "Yeah, I'm not going to school today, don't feel up to it." I mean, a normal reaction for parents is also to feel really frustrated,
Yes.
right? And to get annoyed. And so if parents can just kind of catch themselves and remember, okay, let me just try and understand. Let me try and say things that show I'm curious, I'm not judging, I'm here with them. And that's really hard work, I fully acknowledge. But even if you just do that for 5 minutes, you can sometimes kind of build this buffer of goodwill. Like if kids feel, and teens, if teens feel like their parent is really seeking to get it a little more and to understand what they're going through, then they'll often be a little more open to some guidance or advice.
Do you think that that also is helpful for their anxiety? Because a lot of our listeners have written in and asked about how do you deal with anxiety that's either worse or has appeared after the parent has died?
So the anxiety issue is so interesting because it's sometimes hard to pull apart, right? Where grief is affecting kids' anxiety because we actually just have these kind of skyrocketing levels of anxiety for youth in general, right? Not just youth that are experiencing grief. So that's definitely like the stats show it's really on the rise in that age group. And I think there's, a number of societal reasons for that, which is really difficult. So it's hard sometimes. I would always assume there could be the element of grief at play, right? It's good to always go in open to that, but it could be other issues that are much more important. It could be that there's some stresses at school. It could be that they're spending too much time on social media. It could be friend issues, all sorts of things. Yeah. So, but actually, whether they're anxious because they're grieving or whether they're anxious for any of those other reasons, like the normal kid and teen stuff, the way that you respond would still be similar from my perspective. Like, so the advice I would give is a little bit what we were just talking about. Lead with, there's an expression I really love, which is soft front, strong back from Brene Brown, whose work I really like around emotions. And when she talks about parenting, this is what she says. And I often share this with parents. So the soft front is compassion, empathy, validate their feelings, right? So, yeah, you're feeling really anxious about going to school today. I get it. I wonder if it might be because, and give some sort of guesses about what could be going on. So validate the feelings. The second part is the strong back. So this is where parents want to remember that kids need their parents to kind of show up with that, like a little bit of authority, but not authority in like an authoritarian way, like authority in a leadership way. Hey, I have confidence in you. I really believe, even though it's hard, there might be some benefits. I'd love to see if I could support you, with that goal. I'm here for you. That so it's that sort of two-step approach, no matter what's actually causing the anxiety. And then it's a way to find out more. So if you validate their feelings and you make them feel more understood, you might get a little closer to the truth of what is really going on and what's underlying it. Is it grief or is it something else? It kind of opens up the conversation to get closer.
I'd love to follow up with that from kind of an experience that I had and hear what you have to say about that. So when my husband died, my kids, the two that I'm thinking of, I think were in fourth and first grade, I think. And they continued to go through school and were really struggling in school. And everybody just said, oh, it's grief. It's grief. It's grief. It's grief. And it took a long time for me to say, actually, I don't think this is grief. I think this is something deeper. And it took a lot of kind of almost pushing back against the fact that everything is grief. And actually there was learning disabilities that were going on. They were just in that age group where that would have been caught. But because their dad had just died, everything was just pushed and called grief. And it was a really frustrating situation to be in because I just kept thinking, well, yeah, that's right. Grief is so crazy and everybody experiences it differently. So it just could be grief. But then after a while, it was like, nope, this isn't just grief. And I made up a term for it that I called grief washing. It was calling every problem that they had grief when in fact it wasn't. It wasn't. It added to that, but there was more that needed to happen.
And it must have felt very like invalidating as a parent because you had this gut feeling that it was more than that, but it was hard to get people to listen.
Yeah.
And that's where I always say, I mean, parents are the experts on their kids, right? You know them best. And so it's so important to feel listened to. And I wonder too if some of what was happening is like you said, there was these pre-existing issues that just hadn't come to light yet. And of course, it also could be that under there is grief makes everything harder, right? So it may be the issues surfaced perhaps more because the kids, of course, would have been feeling some stress and the different emotions that are all connected to grief. But like you said, grief was not the cause of the learning issues. So yeah, that's where I think parents really, knowing, trust your gut, push for the things that your kids need. And you're always going to be the biggest expert on your kid, right? Other people can have suggestions and thoughts, but yeah, really trust yourself. So it's good that you persevered and obviously got that figured out.
I don't think we can say figured out, but we're still figuring it out. And it's very
Yeah.
frustrating. But yeah.
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 Um, Back to anxiety. What about separation anxiety? What about this crazy anxiety that comes up? It definitely came up in one of my kids really big that, robbers were going to steal stuff from our house and that mom was going to die or that they were going to die or, just
Yes.
crazy anxiety and not wanting me to ever leave and needing to be by my side and not wanting to go to school. And I could go on.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked about that because this is something that comes up all the time. And what we see is kids show their grief much more through behaviors than through words. As we were talking about earlier, they don't always have the words for what they're feeling inside. And so it's often behavioral changes that actually really let us know when they're struggling. So there's a lot of behaviors that look like they're regressing, so not wanting to sleep alone at night, even though maybe prior to the death, they had been sleeping in their own bed all night. Even like young kids will start having accidents and wetting the bed, even though that had not happened for a long time. Seeking a lot of proximity to the parent, right? The surviving parent, wanting a lot of closeness, calling for the parent in the middle of the night, not wanting to leave them. So one way that I've learned to understand this is, kids are good at kind of slowing things down in these cases and getting their needs met. So look, kind of acting younger and, seeking that proximity, they're getting their needs met for closeness. And I think, when it's really hard on the parent that's trying to manage all of this on their own, but knowing it's okay to respond to that, and like, for example, if it works for that parent, let them come in the bed for a while. You can get back to normal routines later, right? This is often how they're getting their emotional needs met is through that proximity. But it's extremely stressful and hard on a parent who's grieving. It's so exhausting, and so it's like balancing meeting their needs with, again, what we talked about before, gradually and with lots of compassion and support, moving them towards, the more normal routines. And that's also good for them, right? So a kid who had been sleeping on their own at night, for years and suddenly is scared to be, it's good for us to respond with lots of love and emotional support and then to help them move gradually back towards those normal routines because it's actually going to be a good confidence boost for them. And when we're anxious, we tend to avoid whatever's making us anxious, but actually the way to overcome anxiety is through exposure to whatever's scaring us. So that's the tricky thing for parents, right? And I want parents to remind themselves, like, okay, if, for example, my kid, can you think of an example that came up like with your kids, Anita?
All of those were examples, but I mean, I still have one of them who sleeps in my bed from time to time. I mean, like there's usually one or two extra kids in my bed. And that's just something that I've like they always go to bed in their own bed. Like but it's just become something that it's more time consuming and exhausting for me to try and like keep putting them back in their bed.
Yeah.
That's neither here nor there. But just like if I needed to go somewhere, it was like, well, you
Mhm.
can't leave. Like that's kind
Mhm.
of, one example I can think of.
Yes. Yeah. I can. And so sometimes it's good. We sometimes need to figure out what they're scared of and what's going on because sometimes we can do something about that. So actually, like one of the kids I worked with, this is going back years ago. I remember she was so intensely anxious after her dad died. Her mom was so overwhelmed and stressed because this kid was following her like to every room of the house. I think she was about 6 or 7, and she wouldn't let her mom, like this mom could not even, go to the bathroom on her own, right? And that was becoming overwhelming. And so we ended up, delving into it and finding out more. And she had all like the scared of strangers, coming and hurting them. And there were unanswered questions. Her father had died very suddenly. And, there was still some questions for her about what had happened. And so actually finding out more about what was underlying some of those fears and then being able to give her a little more information and just talk about it and open up those conversations about those fears. We did some artwork together. She got it out in different ways, was slowly over time able to help her feel less anxious and give her mom a little space. And like we talked together, I had them come in together and like we were able to open up conversations about like how mom is supposed to balance being there for her all the time. And also, like she would say, like, I have to at some point clean our house or make you dinner, we have to work together. And so I
Or
tried to help
pee. I have to go to
or
the
pee.
bathroom.
Yeah, so having those ongoing conversations with kids about I'm here for you. I like again, I know it sounds like I'm sort of a broken record, but validation is so powerful. Trying to put into words for kids what they're feeling and why, and taking a guess if they're not giving you the words. And if you're wrong, they'll tell you and they'll be like, "No, it's not because I'm scared of A, B, and C. It's just because of this. Like they'll get you closer to the truth. So that's an approach actually that I work on a lot with parents. And maybe in the show notes, I could put like, I actually have a little resource I developed all about emotion coaching. So it's not specific to grief. I should create a grief specific one, but it's about how do you do this three-step process of validate the feelings, provide emotional support for the situation, and then move into practical support, which could be teaching the skill of like thinking in a balanced way. We live in a really safe neighborhood. Our house has locks on the doors. There's no bad guys, that it's highly unlikely anyone's going to hurt us, right? Like that's the thinking in a balanced way is a skill. But first, you have to validate the feelings and it's like you have to bring the emotions down from like way up high back down to kind of ground level. And so the way to get there is to really help them have that moment of like, oh, wow, my mom or my dad, they get it. They're using these words and their tone of voice and the way they're interacting with me. Like I can tell they feel some of what I'm feeling and they get it. That is so soothing for kids, right? And then it gives us, then we can work with them and do some problem solving much easier than if we jump to the problem solving first. So that's a skill for parents, just all of us. I mean, I have a very hard time doing it with my kids, even though I've been a therapist for over 20 years. It's hard with our own kids, but it's a skill to practice and develop. And yeah, I have some information about that I can share.
So you start with the validation, then the Girl Scout cookies, and then the solutions.
Yeah, gotta have cookies. Cookies are very helpful.
Somebody had submitted a question about young adults, and I know there is a time period called emerging adulthood, so like 18 to 29. What about people in that category? So they may not quite feel like they're full adults, even though they're technically 18 and over, but they're still, just coming out of adolescence. If they lose a parent, do you know of any resources for them?
Well, I would agree that they often do get kind of left behind. I think I've definitely had young adults coming to me who've experienced the death of a parent, or young adults who experience the death of a sibling. That's a big one. That's really tough too. And yeah, and they have a lot of trouble. But so I'm not as familiar with the resources in the States, although I think there's some really great resources. I shouldn't say totally unfamiliar, but like I know here in Canada, we have a lot of cities have bereaved families chapters where it's like a kind of nonprofit organization, and they have and they have these sort of open nights where everybody can go, no matter how old you are, no matter what your loss was, and they have a guest speaker and they talk about grief, and then they divide you into smaller groups, like according to loss, like loss of a parent, loss of a child, etc. So there are those kinds of opportunities, but I agree with what is often missing is like a group specifically for young adults. Now, interestingly enough, not I've tried. I've actually had enough people saying, "Oh, I have these young adults and they're looking for support," but then there's never enough to get a whole group going. So I think it's some really want that group support. But yeah, I think you're right that although they're young adults, like that's a really hard stage of life to lose a parent. There is so much ahead that they need that parent's love and support, to navigate. And so I think it is good to look at young adults really as they are the kid of that parent that died. They may be young adults, but it's not the stage of life where they're even close to ready to say goodbye to a parent. And so really validating that for them and making sure that they don't get forgotten, like if the spouse who has lost a person is noticing that like people are always checking in with them, to be able to say like we want everybody checking in with the kids as well, right? They're young adults, but they're really hurting.
I wonder if also that's university age. So I know that universities have counseling centers. So there could be, because that's a centralized place for a lot of young adults, if maybe wherever somebody's child is going to school, they could research some options there. Or I know online there's the Dougie Center. There are some good resources out there for people who might need that.
Yeah, any of those organizations, that handle grief in general, it's always worth young adults reaching out and saying, "Hey, do you have anything for my age group?" Because sometimes if they see enough interest, they'll start something. So for example, Bereaved Families of Ottawa is in my city, and they weren't offering anything for teens. And then they actually had a parent and teen really advocate, and they started a teen group. which was really wonderful. So I definitely speaking up to those organizations, right, that have the funding, that are offering other grief related resources, and letting them know that that's a need. The university all do have like a lot of mental health resources in general now, and also reminding young adults, or parents of young adults, that they can check in with like family doctors for referrals, or through your employee assistance plan, and also word of mouth, asking friends and families if they know of grief therapists too, right?
Yeah. I wonder if it would be a tactic to look into volunteering with the grief organizations that kind of cater to younger kids and teens. And I mean, this is just an idea, but I have a feeling that those places attract people who have experienced loss as well. And so maybe that's a way to connect with other people who have also experienced the loss of even a parent or a sibling and are kind of in that same age group. Like I just know that my kids, when they went to the sharing place, was our grief center, and a lot of the volunteers there were in that young adult category and had at some point in time in their lives lost somebody, and that's why they came back, because either they had been served by being a participant there, or they wanted to be kind of in touch with that grief support community. So I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but
Yes, it's such a good idea. And I actually used that once when I was last year when I created my grief groups again. I had teens that had been part of my group back in 2018 to 2020 when they were preteens, and they were now older, and they didn't like want to attend a group again, but they loved the idea of helping. So I
yeah.
had some of them come as volunteers with the younger kids. They were amazing mentors for a very lively group of younger kids that I had. And they provided a lot of help to us facilitators, but they also acknowledged how much it was helping them and healing them to be able to be with these younger kids. They made a lot of interesting reflections about how much that helped them. Even like I remember one of the girls saying, wow, like sitting and talking to this 10-year-old and remembering I was 10 when my dad died. I was so little. Wow, look at everything I've gone through and look at where I am now, and it was really a great experience. So I love that idea.
So I want to ask you a question that is the worst. And we have lots of people who are always discussing this, and that is the prospect of a parent starting to date again. How do we talk to our kids about that we're going to maybe do that? Or if we've already started, when should we tell them? And like, when do we introduce a new person into our life to our
Mhm.
kids?
So this is something I can share a little bit of what I've learned from the kids who have been in that situation with the parents, because I think kids have a lot to teach us about how we can help them, right, through these things. So it's something definitely that they talk about in therapy with me, or they talk about in our grief group discussions. And so, first of all, I think honesty is really important. So, something I would recommend to parents would be, if this is something that's happening and you feel nervous about talking about it with your kids, just don't try and hide it, because again, kids are very perceptive, and they catch on quick to the phone conversation with the closed door, and then it can actually make them feel anxious if they know something is different and something's up, but they're not quite sure. It could make them actually feel kind of worried, and it could also interfere in trust in your relationship. So just look for ways to be honest and give information a little bit at a time, and as tell your child that you're open to their questions and you don't want to overwhelm them. So that's one piece of advice, just based on what kids have told me. They really don't like it if they feel like it's something their parent is trying to protect them from or hide from them. So watch for that. I also would love to say to all the parents listening, who are in that space of either already dating or thinking about it, if you do whatever you're doing to make sure that you're also building like that whole sense of grief is with us forever, but you want these other parts of your life to be good. You want to find a way to carry your grief and still build a full and beautiful life. And parents, you deserve that. So if this is something that's going to make you happy and be healing for you, your kids are also going to benefit. First of all, you deserve to be healthy and happy and have a full life. And even if there's discomfort and they might resist it in some ways, they will benefit from you being in a good place. They need to see that you are, healthy and happy. I think that's so important. Um, Another piece of advice I would give that I think is really critical is just make sure that when there's someone new being introduced to the kids or that's part of your life, that they don't move at all quickly into any kind of parenting role. It really allows a relationship to build between kids and like a new partner of their parent or potentially a step parent down the line if there's not that burden of that person stepping into a parenting role, which understandably brings up so much emotions for kids who have experienced the death of a parent. So it's like this gift you give to the person that you're dating as well as to your kids to just not put that kind of pressure on it. Allow them to just build connection, through fun interactions or positive interactions and be very, very slow about those roles shifting and changing.
I think that's such good advice. Do you have anything to say about like people who feel a little bit nervous about introducing them to somebody and then maybe the relationship doesn't work out and then there's another loss, like they become attached to that person and then it doesn't work out? Is that a reason to maybe not introduce them?
It's such a good question. I think that's the quandary for so many parents, right? You don't want to hide it from the kids and be secretive. And often it's kind of just impossible because if a parent is the only parent, if you need to go out for the evening, like, it's you need to kind of make arrangements and be honest. But I know that a lot of parents do. That comes from love and protection. You want to protect your kids from any hurt. So to me, there's no perfect way forward other than take it really slow in terms of how much they're introduced to the kids and the role they're taking on. Because obviously, if it's like that person is kind of like, okay, mom's, partner, the person they're dating, they're like, they visit our house, they come and they hang out a bit, but they're not stepping into a parenting role, then it's obviously going to be much less of a loss if the relationship doesn't last. And I mean, from what I've seen with kids is, that loss of maybe the parent having someone new in their life and then, it doesn't work out in general, I've seen kids handle that very well. They've experienced such a bigger loss. They have like perspective as well. That, again, if the parent is kind of being open and talking to them about it and, sharing honestly, like what's happening, and then supporting them with the information, right? Just make space for that validation of feelings, letting them know it's okay for them to have their feelings. That's the hard thing, parents have a right to also explore that part of their life, and we can't protect kids from the ups and downs that are also to come with that.
Oh man, can we kidnap you and bring you to my house?
Be a little fly on the wall. Maybe we could have like a little like walkie-talkie, and I could
Yes.
say this now.
It would be an international crime though to kidnap you, so I think we will not do that. We'll just let you stay in Canada. Thank you so much, Joanne. This has been so helpful.
It was so great talking with both of you. And yeah, and I guess I would just say sometimes it is tough, even after working with all these families. I don't always feel like I have all the right answers because what I want to also kind of remind everybody is everybody's grief journey is different and every family is different. And so, again, you know your kids best, you're the expert. So, what works for one person might be different for another around how you support your kids, around how you introduce someone new that you're dating, and different is okay, right? Because everyone's journey is their own unique journey. But I hope the little tidbits of information help people to maybe have some direction with some of those struggles that are understandably present.
One final question. What is your favorite cheese?
Goat cheese, 100%. I
No
love any
pause.
kind of goat cheese. And that's because I can't have the other kinds of cheese. So I'm very
Oh,
grateful for goats.
Ah, lactose intolerant.
Yes, cows are not my friend. So, yeah,
Sad.
goat cheese all the way.
Joanne, do you have a website or a way for people to access any of your resources?
I do. So my website is doucettetherapy.com, all one word. And other resources. So I also have an email, like I send out monthly newsletters to families all about issues around grief, about just parent support. And so again, I could provide a link for you. It's on the homepage of my website. If people go there, there's you can fill that out if you're interested in receiving monthly newsletters with info.
That's
Yeah.
so great. Well, we hope that the people listening it has been helpful for you. And thank you, Mel, for sitting through our parenting edition. You're a good sport.
Hey, I learned some things too.
Excellent.
I want everyone's kids to be okay and everyone.
If you guys want to keep the podcast going, will you check out our Patreon? It's patreon.com/WWDN.
If you'd like to buy us tacos, go to buymeacoffee.com/widowwedonoww.
Come check out the Widow Wives Club on Facebook. It's our private group. Just make sure you answer all the questions and don't get mad at us.
Yep, that's it.
Okay. Till we get to talk to you again, I'm Anita.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Joanne.
We're just two young widows and one super smart grief expert. And we're all just trying to figure out widow.
We
Do.
now. This is my favorite thing to discuss with you.
Tell me, what is it?
One of my favorite things. I do enjoy tacos and cheese and dogs. This is about how you cannot pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars for a phone plan, especially when you're a widow, your person is dead, you might have kids, you might need another option, and you just want your phone to work, you want unlimited texting and service, and you want it to be like $25 a month.
It blows my mind that they have plans that start at $15 a month. That is so cheap. And the cool thing is it uses other 5G networks, and so you don't have to pay extra for that, and you still get great service.
Yep, Anita and I have traveled all over, and I have used my phone. So I highly recommend it. And my mom's even on it. When my dad died, we put his phone down to the cheapest plan, which is $15 a month. And I think my mom's on the $20 a month plan, and it's so worth it. It's so much cheaper than what we were all paying before. So I highly recommend it if you're on a budget or not. Who cares? Ryan Reynolds is in charge of the company, and they send you free stickers with Ryan Reynolds temporary tattoos. It's kind of the best. So if somebody wants to sign up, what can they do, Anita?
Go to trymintmobile.com/WWDN. Seriously, you guys, such a great idea. Save yourself some money.
And if you're worried about losing data or having any changes with your phone, not going to happen. They walk you through it. Everything's fine. It's the easiest process of all time. Again, that's
trymintmobile.com/WWDN.